an essay being done, perhaps one a week. And, for example, there's one here. It's an essay on London. London is very old. It is said to be the largest city in the world. At any rate, it is very dirty. There are lots of palaces in London. There are lots of interesting places to see also. The Tower of London, Westminster Abbey, St. Peter's Cathedral, the Mint, where they make money, and many more places. Then there are some awfully nice parks. Regent's Park is very nice. The zoo is in it. My favorite beasts are lions, tigers, bears, elephants. Lions spelled Lyons.
My grandmother used to, of course, teach her younger children herself. Have big round table and they sit and do their early lessons. And then the other thing she made them do was to walk around her sitting room with books on their heads. And I suppose that's why Queen Elizabeth has a wonderful walk and stance.
Here we have a book of drawings, and in this picture we have the pink ferocious animal called the Child Eater about to devour Elizabeth. And we have a little girl here on her knees with tears, hoping not to be eaten up by this terrible-looking animal.
She was very imaginative, and her imagination was furnished by the acting chest, and she used to bring out medieval dresses, beautiful brocades, laces, velvets, and I think one of her favorite characters was the Princess of Bohemia, and she dressed up as this romantic princess. George Gage, Viscount Gage, he said it was like living in a Van Dyck portrait. Everything was perfect. Nothing was out of place. Everybody was beautiful. Everybody was good. It was a magical world, a fairyland. She was born at the beginning of the century. Therefore, she was 14 years old on August the 4th, the day that the First World War was declared. The extraordinary thing was that when she went to her birthday party to a theatre, age 14, and everybody was wildly excited, and she was too. They weren't wildly excited as they should have been because it was her birthday, but because war had been declared. And at that date, there hadn't been a war for a long time, not a serious war. And people were mad with joy and excitement.
Elizabeth's 4 older brothers joined up, blissfully unaware, as were the rest of the nation, of what lay in wait for them in Flanders fields. For Elizabeth, her childhood was rapidly drawing to a close.
Glamis became a convalescent home for young wounded soldiers. And life totally changed for everybody. Her elder sister Rose became a trained nurse and helped look after the soldiers. And she helped an enormous amount. She obviously was only 14 when the war began, and she was still doing lessons. She had a governess. And when she wasn't doing lessons, I'm quite certain she spent an enormous amount of time helping look after these wounded soldiers. She ran errands for them up to the village to buy cigarettes and sweets, and she played billiards with them in the billiard room, and she played cards with them, and I believe she played the piano to them quite a lot too. And I'm quite certain they were some of the first people outside her own family to fall under her spell.
She and her mother were the hostesses. So from 14 to 18, she was doing a woman's job. But she did it with the artistry and fun and affection of a young girl. And she was so popular, she did it so well, that quite a number of the soldiers, when they were convalescent and left, wrote to her and kept up with her. The soldiers she was meeting were from all different walks of life. She was seeing at this impressionable age that there were totally different kinds of people in the world from the ones she'd met hitherto. And she loved them, she liked them, she got on with them and they got on with her. And it was like a kingdom opening before her.
Oh, 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 it's a lovely war. Go and be a soldier, eh? Oh, it's a shame to take the pay.
They had really quite a lot of sadness themselves, Queen Elizabeth's family too, in the war. Her brother Fergus had been home on leave to see his baby daughter for the first time, and then he went back and was killed at the Battle of Loos. So that was a terrible sadness. And then, in fact, my father-in-law, Michael, he was missing, believed killed. The first they knew that he was alive was the fact that Coutts's bank rang up and said that he'd cashed a cheque. How he managed to do that from a prison camp in either France or Germany, wherever it was, I have no idea, but it's the most marvellous idea that you can cash a cheque and your family know you're alive. So much rejoicing went on, I'm sure.
Another story from family folklore concerns Elizabeth's wartime adventures with her sister Rose.
Queen Elizabeth visited my mother at Felixstowe, where my mother had a semi-detached house. And that's where they caught a German spy between them. And because the walls were very thin, and the man living on the other side was a dentist. And you used to have these sailors and soldiers coming up rather late and apply them with drink after he'd treated them, I suppose. So one evening they crept out and hid behind bushes, and they heard these sailors telling the dentist where they were going, what they were going to do. And so next day they rushed off and told Lord Fisher all about it. He was the admiral in charge down there. And in due course, they were thrilled to see police marching up to their house next door and taking this man away. And then they told this story to the king, and he was all for giving them medals, because apparently they're entitled to medals for catching a German spy. And they had said, oh, no, don't do that.
I've always thought that one source of Elizabeth's strength was the fact that in her formative years, between the ages of 14 and 18, she experienced the First World War. In a sense, that was liable either to break you or make you, because it was certainly if you were in any position of responsibility, and if you were doing a bit of nursing as she was, or she was, in a curious way, the right age to arrive at the age of 18, 19, with a very serious adolescence, because the war was a serious time. She came out just at the end of, after the end of the war, about 1920. She had what was the equivalent of a debutante dance. Putting it in very simple language, it was designed to afford a girl the chance to meet an eligible young man of her own standing and possibly make a happy marriage thereby. A number of marriages, I think, were shaped up during the Debs season when Debs met nice young men.
I think originally people used to be presented at court. They had their name read out and they all came up and curtsied individually, because I remember my aunts telling me about that and saying how exciting it was. And there was Queen Mary in green covered with emeralds. The King George V, smiled at my aunt and recognised her. At least she thought he did, but perhaps he didn't. And it was quite special and quite different. And then people entertained a little bit for you, and they gave dances and asked young men. And, you had a very jolly time. But I think in Queen Elizabeth's case, it was just after a terrible war, and I think everybody was over the moon that the war was over and were enjoying themselves as much as they possibly could, because it was all so wonderful that such a terrible thing had now ended.
We tended to be a bit frantic. Girls drank, girls smoked for the first time, and all the rest of it. I think Elizabeth, don't forget she was based in Scotland, which is always rather more sedate than the lower part of the country. I think Elizabeth lived in a rather different circle. Nothing was altered more, really, than dancing. In those days, a girl, certainly a girl at a debutante dance, would have an escort. Either her mother or a companion or somebody would be there. And however many young men she danced with, the companion would be there and probably would see her home. One or two people were daring to turn up in dinner jackets. But otherwise, it was spoiled shirt, wing collar, white tie, tails. That was the uniform. And a black tie was seen to be, well, all the makings of a cad, really. If you turned up in a black tie, you probably wouldn't be asked again. You had a card for your dance. You had a card in which you entered the names of the ladies that you most wanted to dance with. And you wrote these down. And, of course, at the end of an evening, a man with decent manners would have danced with up to a dozen different girls, 6 in the first half, 6 in the second half. Today, as you know, people go to a dance with a girlfriend and stay with the girlfriend throughout the dance, and that's that. On the whole, I think that the first was the more, I don't say civilized, but it certainly gave you a better opportunity to study the market.
She was the Deb of the Year and wildly popular. I've talked to people who were young men in her circle, and they one and all agree on her charm and fascination. And one of them, a great friend of mine, George Gage, Viscount Gage, just said quite definitely, everybody was in love with her. We were all in love with her.
I think undoubtedly that at the age of 18 or 19, whatever she was at the end of the war, she was more mature, not precocious, but far more mature than most girls are at that age. And I think it gave her a certain cachet, which together with a fairly exuberant personality, I mean, it was always a charming personality, and all that helped to endear her to the young men who undoubtedly did flock to her train. I mean, there was heavy competition for her.
My father may have danced with Queen Elizabeth when she was Lady Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon. He certainly talked about her, and he certainly said she was one of the most beautiful young ladies on the go, but I think they didn't know each other well, but I think he certainly talked to her, and he probably queued up to try and dance with her.
Lady Elizabeth had many suitors, and her dance card from the Forfar County Ball includes the names of Lord Gage, Lord Doon, Prince Paul of Serbia, and James Stuart, twice.
James came from a very good Scottish family. He was thoroughly good-looking, He was highly bright and intelligent. If I was a hostess in the right year, I would have certainly had James on my list for debutante parties. Absolutely, yes, rather. I watched him very carefully, though, after that.
My father, James Stuart, was an equerry to the Duke of York at Buckingham Palace. And he'd come out of the First World War with a couple of military crosses, etc., etc., etc. And they were all young men out of the First World War, you see. And so they had quite a jolly, happy life, because that was when the Bright Young Things or something of the 1920s, there was a terribly small circle. I think it was called the 400, the posh, the elite, the aristocrats. I can picture grand country house parties and shooting parties and balls at Devonshire House, and they were all rather irresponsible and gay and happy, but I think rather innocent.
Amongst the 400, Elizabeth had a group of close friends whose reputation earned them the name the Mad Hatters.
The Mad Hatters suited them as a name. They truly were. Oh, they had great house parties. In the evening, they pushed back the furniture in the drawing room and rolled out the beautiful rugs and started to dance. Of course, sometimes we never knew what they got up to because we weren't there. We would know next morning they'd been dancing because there wasn't a bit of furniture in its right place in the drawing room.
My father and our lovely Queen Mother Elizabeth had what I would describe as a romance. By romance, I think I really and truly mean things like walking in the garden in twilight, holding hands, kissing under a flowering cherry tree with the petals falling on top of your heads and your shoulders, and then walking back into the ballroom, and then the old rabbity old women would say, "Oh, look at them, I wonder what they've been up to, you see."
Jimmy, he was a bit of what you would call a daredevil. He was really handsome chap. He was very tall. And when he wore the kilt, he really looked king of the meadow. Yeah. He just always seemed to be bubbling over with mischief, and made her bubble also. But then, as we used to say, well, they're just like us, they're young, and it's just fun, you know.
I have no earthly idea whether my dad proposed to Queen Elizabeth, but it's perfectly possible. I have a vague suspicion that the beautiful Queen Mother would say something like, "Oh, James, don't be so stupid."
In the summer of 1920, a new suitor arrived on the scene. Prince Albert, who only days earlier had become the Duke of York. As fate would have it, he was introduced to Elizabeth by none other than his equerry, James Stuart.
The Duke of York said to his equerry, who is my father, "Who is that lovely lady?" And my dad said, "Oh, that's Elizabeth Bayes. Have you never met her? She's an awfully nice girl." So the future king said, "Oh, James, maybe you could just introduce us."
As you know, he was not as glamorous as his elder brother. He wasn't as glamorous as David, who became Edward VIII and the Duke of Windsor. He was delicate. He'd had health problems. I can remember hearing him lecture us at school, which is a very brave thing to do, and he suffered from a painful stammer. I've always imagined that Elizabeth was attracted by him as somebody who, in a sense, was not only extremely nice and very modest about himself, very diffident about, in a sense, what he had to offer. I think that's always attractive in a man. But I think she also felt that he was, when we do feel like this, somebody who she would like to look after, you know, rather sort of care for and cheer up and all the rest of it.
My dear Elizabeth, thank you ever so much for all your kindness to me last week at Glamis. I did so love my time there and hated having to leave you. It is very sad to think that we shall not meet now for some time. I was so distressed at having shot so badly last week at Glamis, as I did so want to have shot well.
I knew the Duke of York well, time I was about 10 and 11. And of course one heard so much of the beautiful Prince of Wales and his golden hair and blue eyes. And we met him, my cousin Anne and I, at Glamis on a funny little narrow staircase. And my uncle stopped and said, "David, here are two nieces, Mary Lusengore and Anne Bowes-Lyon." And we gave little awkward bobs. We couldn't curtsy on a small staircase. But I do remember feeling so disappointed because the Prince of Wales didn't look half as attractive as my Uncle Bertie, who was not only taller, his eyes were more blue, and he had much more definite features. He was a much better figure of a man.
My dear Elizabeth, thank you so much for your letter asking me when I'm coming to Glamis. I should love to come the last week in September, if I may. London is very dull, and there's nothing going on at all, and nobody's here. I have been leading a very quiet life, with no fast little parties, as you call them.
He found the Duke of York camp. And the idea of doing this was, I mean, it gives you a very good idea what sort of a chap he was. He thought in the post-war years it would be a very nice idea to bring together boys from public schools and boys from national schools. And he had this camp. It was a mixture of chaps, and he led them. And I can remember, I can see them now. They song, you know, camp sing song and all that. And there he would be leading the chorus. Very interesting idea, that, and very, really ahead of the time. The idea of bringing together the national schoolboy and the public schoolboy, and putting them in a camp together, and getting them to get on and understand each other. Quite something, that. It's a very attractive side of him. If you can see why Elizabeth was attracted to a man like that. Great, you know, a bit of imagination there.
Prince Albert was by far the best athlete of all his brothers. He incidentally won the doubles with his aide, Louis Gregg, the tennis doubles at Wimbledon. Prince Albert and Louis Gregg, they won it.
My dear Elizabeth, I heard from Fasti yesterday, who sent me her photos which she took at Glamis, and they're so good. She is not in London now, but I will keep your warning about her in mind. I have got the inspection of the special constables this afternoon, which I hope will go off all right. Thanking you again, ever so much, for asking me up to Glamis, and being so kind to me in every way. Ever, yours very sincerely, Albert. As Bertie grew more fond of Elizabeth, his thoughts naturally turned to marriage. Sensitive to royal protocol, he approached a friend for advice.
My father was a fairly new Member of Parliament in 1922, and Louis Gregg knew him, who was secretary to the Duke of York, and he particularly asked him to go out to Dunkirk to the laying of the foundation stone of a memorial, and the Duke of York was doing the laying of the foundation stone. So when the ceremony was over, he sort of hung about by the gangway, and Louis Gregg came running up to him and said, "Come on the naval destroyer." And then after a short time, he was introduced to the Duke of York in the wardroom. And there he spent about 3 hours with him, talking as two young men together, and could see that the Duke of York was very churned up and worried about his life, and something was worrying him very much. And after a lot of conversation, he told my father that he was terribly worried that some wonderful lady was not going to marry him, and if he didn't marry this lady, he wouldn't marry at all. And my father said that he must pursue this, and he had had a great struggle to get my mother to accept him, and that he had gone on, and if she hadn't accepted him, he wouldn't have married either. The Duke of York said, "Well, the trouble is that there has to be an emissary to go for us, and the king, my father, feels very strongly about this, that we mustn't propose ourselves because we might be turned down." So my father said in 1922, "You've got to go yourself and talk to her." And this was his advice: go and see her yourself and put the question.
Most young women would be attracted by the idea of marrying a son of the king. It was his rank, I think, where he stood in life, that actually put her off. I've always understood that is why Elizabeth turned him down first time round. She felt that it would be too onerous to be a daughter-in-law of the king.
At first, she was not attracted by the idea of royalty as she saw it, everything mapped out, everything done in one way and not in any other way. No experiment, no change, nothing new.
The difference between being a member of the aristocracy and a member of the royal family is that you are much less of a private person. As a member of the aristocracy, of course, you have responsibilities and duties, but you can be, to a certain extent, fairly private. But if you once join the royal family, you don't have very much privacy left. An awful lot of your life has to go in service to other people, and you don't have very much left for yourself. And I think it's quite a burden and quite an undertaking for anyone to take on. And as far as marriage is concerned, it doesn't make any difference whether it's a prince who asks you, or an earl, or a dustman, or anything else. I think what really matters is if it's somebody that you love. And unless you love the person, you couldn't dream of marrying them. And if you do, it doesn't matter which they are.
I believe that he, on his side, was passionately in love with her, had no hesitations. I think she must have felt exalted and privileged in one way, that as another human being should be able to offer her so much, not in a worldly sense, in a human sense. His whole mind and heart, it wasn't going to be a half marriage, a real marriage of two minds and two hearts.
He, to his credit, I think I'm right in saying, persisted. Always a good example of persistence, that. Won the girl.
Many months later, he never heard again from the Duke of York, but many months later he met at an official dinner. And when he shook hands with the Duke of York, very quietly the Duke of York said, "It worked. Have a look and you'll see it coming out in the Gazette in a few days' time." Yes, my father may have changed history by giving him that advice, because I don't think the Queen Mother would have listened to a third party.
My brother and I, we went at the wedding. I was invited to be bridesmaid, but my mother thought that's much too naughty. I wasn't allowed.
I can see that red bit of carpet now. You've seen pictures, perhaps cartoons, of Mrs. Mob with this sort of bonnet thing round her head. It was just like a mob with her hair.
There were some features of the wedding which were characteristic of that period and which weren't to be repeated, I think, fortunately. One being that it wasn't broadcast, it wasn't put on what we called in those days the wireless, in case there were some people listening to the broadcast of the wedding in a pub with a glass in their hand, or sitting down when God Save the King was played. It all seems rather delightfully ludicrous now. I think they were complementary to each other, which is always a wonderful bonus. Many things in common, but also gaps in one are filled by the virtues and talents in the other. And this is certainly how it worked with them.
Well, I think the Queen Mother started her role when she was Duchess of York very quickly, taking part in public engagements. I believe she was always known as the Smiling Duchess. Is an amazing thing for someone who, I sometimes think that, who started as a small girl at Glamis.
It was she who helped to cure his stammer by giving him a proper treatment of breathing, which she incidentally must have been passionately interested because she did it with him so that they could do it together and help each other, which I've always thought was very touching. It always annoys her when people begin suggesting that it was she who wore the trousers, both in their engagement and in their marriage. I think it was very far from that. He had an extremely good mind.
I think they made a wonderful pair. I think she knew some of his weaknesses. All men have weaknesses. Women have many fewer weaknesses, but all men have weaknesses. She knew his weaknesses very well. It was a thoroughly happy marriage. And certainly, if you look up the old black and white pictures of the Queen Mother in her young days, certainly when they were starting their family, she always looked blissful, and so did he, for that matter.
When their married life began, they were a really very happy couple. And as far as both of them were concerned, this is what they expected to continue and wanted. And the culmination of their happiness was, of course, the birth of their two daughters, Princess Elizabeth and Princess Margaret Rose. And they were a really close, united family. And everything was rosy, except that in this life, nothing always is always.
In 1936, King Edward VIII, the Duke of York's brother, faced a crisis of conscience over his ill-fated love for the American divorcee Wallis Simpson. The affair was to have a profound effect on the lives of the Duke and his family, and was to shock the British aristocracy.
It was looming for 2-3 years. It's something that might happen, which one really rather hoped he'd grow out of his infatuation.
My father had a dog, a dachshund, called Wally, after Wallis Simpson. You know, she was a joke, in other words, a joke woman. And I think it was a little bit horrific.
A few hours ago, I discharged my last duty as King and Emperor. I have found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility and to discharge my duties as King as I would wish to do, without the help and support of the woman I love.
The language of the speech really amazed me. It shocked me, because here was our abdicating king speaking in the language I thought of women's magazines. No, I mean, women's magazines, I read women's magazines, and that's why I knew it was their language. But it wasn't the right language for him. But I believe Churchill helped him put in a few touches. But of course, if Churchill had been making that speech, the whole thing would have been very different. He'd have got it. But with Edward VIII, to me, it was pathetic.
I heard my parents listening to the abdication speech on the wireless, and I asked my governess about it, and she said it was a very sad day for everybody, because it meant that the king had failed in his duty to his people, and he had put himself before his people, and I think it was a very sad day for everybody. And I don't think he perhaps considered what the consequences would be for his brother and sister-in-law either.
It was a time of most appalling stress for them and all the royals. It was a great shock, I think, that it could turn out like that.
Rather casually and callously, in a way, Edward VIII just handed it over to his brother, to his younger brother. It was a very traumatic period for the future George VI.
I think that both of them, in a sense, were better equipped for the job than drama would make you believe. It was dramatic that the brother, the unmarried brother, should suddenly depart and declare he couldn't go on governing, couldn't go on ruling without the woman he loved. And so naturally history wants to suggest that two very inexperienced people went together. In my judgment, neither of them were as inexperienced as some romantic history makes out. They were very, very well equipped for serious work and proved it,
Queen Elizabeth was able to show us a kind of queenship, a queenliness, which nobody had imagined before, and which I'm sure she herself had no idea she possessed. These amazing, almost psychological gifts that she had of accessibility and approachability and communicating with the people.
Prior to the coronation, Prince Albert changed his name to George VI.
Baldwin's retirement coincided with the coronation of King George VI and Queen Elizabeth, and it gave him a very memorable final speech at the House of Commons, which I heard. His words about the young King and Queen, called unexpectedly, I think was his phrase, to the most tremendous task on earth. It was a very, if you think, a very emotive phrase, that called unexpectedly to the most tremendous task on earth. And in those days, with the imperial responsibilities as well as national responsibilities, that wasn't overstating it. And certainly, it's the only time in the whole of my political experience he stopped. The debate ended. When Baldwin sat down, I saw Shinwell tear up the speech that he was about to make. It ended the debate. The House stopped.
One has also to ask what the reaction of Queen Elizabeth would have been when she first heard of the abdication. Was it something exciting and wonderful for her, or was it going to be the destruction of her world? Well, I'm afraid it was nearer to the second, because she did realize that it was going to be the most incredible strain on her beloved husband. And I think after his death, not only she, but many people thought that it had shortened his life.
Oh, very proud to think that the Queen to be crowned was one's aunt. And she looked so lovely, she looked like a fairy queen indeed.
Well, people have guardian angels, and sometimes it seemed to me that perhaps countries have guardian angels too. And somebody was looking out for Britain when they gave us our last king and queen. I think we were very lucky indeed to have had them.
Looking back on all they went through, and particularly that Second War, I think the nation was very lucky too. I think it was lucky for the nation that he won his girl, really. Very lucky. I can't think of anybody else who could have done quite the same thing.